Hello, my beautiful blossoms, blooms, and buds. I'm Rosebud Reads, and welcome to my book garden. Welcome also to another of our holiday special fanfics. This one today is called What is Seen by CaveteDracones, and I am so excited to read this. This is a SVSS fanfiction. I'm super thankful that CaveteDracones allowed me to read it. It is a very interesting one, and I cannot wait. The original material is owned by Seven Seas, but we're just playing in the sandbox, and that's okay. I'm trying to think. I mean, of course, if you enjoy, or even if you don't, like go say hey to the author, give him a kudos, give him a comment. You can find the link in the description below, and I'm sorry, I had a brain fart. We're just gonna go ahead and get into it. I'm sorry. Okay, What is Seen by CaveteDracones. Summary. What is seen is not always the real truth. Truth-compelling artifacts in the hands of an enemy to one side, system-mandated silence on the other, and Shen Qingqiu caught between the two. Is it too late to go back to the water prison? Chapter 1. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It wasn't. There was a high pounding in his ears as Liu Binghe watched his Shizun choke on his own blood. Crimson spilled from those pale lips down past his chin and the silvery sheen of the torque around his slender neck to disappear into the black outer robe and drip onto the elegant hands tied with immortal binding cables. Around them were shouts were arising as the assembled members of the Jianghu reacted with shock and anger. And still, Shen Qingqiu bled freely. Mu Shishu was the first to reach Shen Qingqiu, breaking past the cultivators who tried to bar his path as though they were wisps of smoke. He cradled his Shixian's head, hands sparking with qi, as he ran furious diagnostics while Shizun struggled to breathe. It's a silencing curse, he concluded, voice unusually tight for a normally unflappable man. Shizun shuddered and collapsed, and Liu Binghe at last found himself able to move as he surged to his feet in terror. But no, there was one of Mu Shishu's acupoint needles embedded in Shizun's neck, rendering him unconscious and buffering him from the effects of the curse he was apparently under. The silencing curse. Binghe had hurt Shizun in the water prison for staying silent. He had hurt Shizun for staying silent while Shizun was under a silencing curse. Binghe thought he was going to be sick. His qi burned like acid in his spirit veins. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Binghe had expressed his frustrations to a handful of Huanhua disciples that Shen Qingqiu had not spoken to him during his visit. He provided them no further details. Nothing about what answers he sought, nor of how Liu Binghe had lost his temper and used his blood jiu against his own beloved, and most definitely nothing about how Shizun's robes had torn in his hands like paper instead of the high-class fabrics Binghe knew them to be. Binghe remembered little of what he'd said to Shizun after that moment, only that he'd fled after all but tearing off his own black outer robe and using it to cover Shizun's perfect, naked torso before Binghe could do something even more ill-considered than that visit had already been as a whole. Huanhua's palace's rumor mill was every bit as effective as Binghe remembered of Kangqian mountain sects. It was the very next morning that the palace master had approached the guest disciple with a gentle, genial smile and offered to use Huanhua artifact at Shen Qingqiu's swiftly approaching... Sorry, I'm turning that off. I thought I did, but I did not. Swiftly approaching trial. This master has set Gongyi Zhao to the task of retrieving the torque of the unburdened heart from our stores and safekeeping it until the trial. It is an artifact of limited utility, but this master has found that on occasion it can provide assistance with compelling a confession. Lao Gonzu explained. Its wearer cannot remain silent and cannot speak a lie until the torque is removed. Yet, this cannot be confused with compelling a truthful answer. Bingha bowed his head in understanding. The palace master is wise not to use it at every trial, for there are many men who could claim innocence through misdirection. Bingha would know. Shizun had taught him how to twist words in such a way himself, with clever games over their shared meals in the bamboo cottage. Bingha had used those very skills to gain entry to Wanhua Palace, and yet avoid accepting discipleship. Lao Gonzu nodded. Indeed, Lu Gonzi is most perceptive for his youth, though perhaps he simply knows Peak Lord Shen's character best of all. Lu Bingha tensed, then forcibly relaxed his shoulders. Huanhua and its palace master were yet useful to his long-term goals. Shizun's incarceration might not be going the way Bingha had hoped it might, but it wouldn't do to discard all plans every time a Huanhua cultivator impugned Shizun's character. No matter how many times Lu Bingha had had to remind himself of that during his stay in the gaudy halls, while in the back of his mind he kept careful track of names, faces, and the number of occurrences. He was greatly looking forward to the day that he might repay those insults. In the meantime, however, he looked forward to getting long-awaited answers from Shen Qingqiu. This master cannot help but wonder how his Shidi might have been afflicted with such a potent silencing curse on the very eve of being questioned using an artifact that would compel him to speak regardless. Yu Qingyuan's smile, ever present, was as a blade to the throat of each gathered cultivator. The majority of the spectators had been ushered to the far end of the room, with only the highest echelons from each sect remaining near. Even among those with such advanced cultivation, however, the sect leader's oppressive intent was a strain to bear. Even Luo Bingha found it unpleasant enough that he only kept as close as needed for his superior hearing to catch every hushed word. Chu Haitang had also drawn as near as she could, though her face was wan as she supported herself against the wall. Luo Bingha resisted the urge to lash out against her. He wasn't sure whether there was anyone in existence that he loathed more than that woman. Lu Qingga might have hovered around Shizun like an unwanted fly, but at least he had never dared to claim to be Shizun's fiancé. Surely he must have cursed himself, the little palace mistress cried out, pale and trembling as she clung to her father's sleeves, to keep the truth of his crimes from being brought to justice. Such skills our Shen Qingqiu must have to inflict such a potent silencing curse upon himself while his qi was bound. Qingqi coolly reposed, staring the girl down with an unimpressed gaze of a large cat. The little palace mistress scowled back, fuming. Well, the question of how Peak Lord Shen came to be cursed is indeed a curious one that will bear further investigation. This Lao Gonzu would ask how it might be broken so that this trial might continue, the old palace master said, folding his hands into his sleeves without care for how it knocked his daughter's hand away. She quickly moved back from the gathering, no longer bolstered by the support of the old cultivator's qi. There are those who have waited years for their justice and who should not need to wait even longer. What can Peak Lord Mu tell us about this spell? Mu Shishu rose from where he'd been continuing to prod at Shen Qingqiu's qi, Lu Qingga standing guard over the both of them and scowling fiercely at anyone who stared overlong at the sprawled unconscious form. Bingha itched to go over to them, to straighten his Shizun's limbs and cushion his head from the hard floor, but how could he touch Shizun with these hands, when Bingha now knew himself to be the beast Shizun had named him all those years ago? This master finds that he must clarify his earlier statement, Mu Qingfan said gravely. While I do not doubt the existence of the curse, having felt its effects on Shen Qingqiu's qi, neither now nor then have I been able to sense the curse itself. It may be solely a silencing curse, or it may be a more generalized curse with a silencing effect once a trigger condition is met. That I cannot sense it within Shen Qingqiu when it is not actively affecting him may mean that the curse has been especially hidden to prevent detection and disruption, or that the curse has not been laid on him directly, but rather affects him through a focal artifact. He frowned. This Mu Qingfan finds himself in a quandary. In order to gather more information about the curse would need to be activated, but this master absolutely cannot recommend triggering the curse to study it, given the damage it was able to inflict on Shen Qingqiu over such a short period of time. Yu Qingyuan's hand clenched around the hilt of his sword at the thought of causing further harm to Shen Qingqiu, an action that was not missed by those around him. We will seek an alternative. No one dared gainsay him. If this disciple may have a suggestion, Gong Yi Xiao said quietly, bowing to the gathered elders from a short distance away in apology for the interruption. Speak, Gong Yi Gonzi, Yu Qingyuan said first. Gong Yi Xiao turned to his master. Shizun, while this disciple was retrieving the torque of the unburdened heart, he recognized another artifact stored in the hall. A mirror that he recalls was used to reveal curses, possessions, and other foul conditions. Lao Gonzu gazed at him for a long moment. This master knows of the artifact, though it has not been used in decades by this master's recollection. Very well, let us use it and be done with this. This trial has gone on overlong as it is. Indeed, Yu Qingyuan said, the smile on his face still terribly mild. It couldn't have been a full Shichen before a bronze mirror, over an arm's length in width and polished to a high shine, was carried into the room by two sweating disciples. The old palace master and a master of Shaohua Temple, with an artifact speciality, quickly orchestrated the disciples to stand with the mirror directly across from Shen Qingqiu, though tilted away, and Binghe moved to place himself in a way that would allow him to see Shizun's reflection. At Mu Qingfan's direction, Lu Qingge knelt and shifted Shen Qingqiu until the unconscious cultivator was braced against him, on his knees but kept reasonably upright by the arm around his chest. Binghe's fists tightened until his nails dug into his palms. Surely there was no need for Lu Qingge to hold Shizun that closely. Once everything was in place, Mu Qingfan approached the pair and knelt beside them, facing towards the mirror. He took Shen Qingqiu's wrist, concentrating for a moment, then nodded to signal his readiness. The Huanhua disciples tilted the mirror forward until Shen Qingqiu was reflected in the polished bronze surface, and the room gasped nearly as one. The figure reflected in the mirror was not the aloof, elegant Shen Qingqiu known to the Jianghu. The person reflected was much smaller, thinner, delicate, bordering on gaunt. He wore a single shapeless garment of indeterminate color, night clothes, that covered his kneeling body completely, and the unkempt hair that hung in front of his closed eyes perhaps reached his collarbone and no further. Still, while the change in demeanor was astonishing, the fine arch of his brows, the point of his chin, and the sharp bones of his two thin cheeks were clearly visible as Shen Qingqiu. And yet the true cause behind the collective shock of the onlookers was the unnatural blue light of the revealed curse. Glowing blue chains wrapped several times around the reflected figure, chains attached to shackles at the wrists, neck, and trailing behind him, presumably to his ankles. The other ends of the chain led upward, fading into the thin air like the strings of a puppet. One shackle hung free, the wrist that had once been caged in it banded by a thin scar. Bruises spread from beneath the shackle on the other wrist, as though its captive had struggled to break free and failed. Blue light stretched across Mir Shizun's face in the shape of a gag, made macabre by the blood that continued to drip down the reflection's chin. Bingha turned, distressed, to find that the blood was confined to the mirror. Shizun had not actually begun to bleed from his mouth again. Xiaoju, Yu Qingyuan whispered, his face losing its smile for the first time in Lu Bingha's recollection and instead contorting, agonized. Further away, Chu Haitang had covered her mouth with both hands as she began to cry. Mu Qingfan tensed, his hand still holding Shizun's wrist. The free wrist, Bingha realized, as he glanced again at the mirror. The wrist of the same hand that had been affected with Sower's rash, that had been infected with without a cure as Shizun protected Bingha. Did that mean something? He thought it did, but what did that mean? It's reacting, Mu Qingfan warned. The blue glow of the chains had begun to pulse, shining characters moving along the links of the chains too swiftly to be read. Turn the mirror away, the old palace master ordered, but it was too late. Though nothing was visible outside of the mirror, the reflection showed the chain with the empty shackle lashing out. The disciples holding the mirror and those cultivators standing the closest cried out as it shattered as though made of glass rather than metal, and flying fragments shredded robes and drew blood. The room dissolved into disorder, cultivators rushing to and fro in a way that would have had Shizun tisking irritably from behind his fan and reiterating that Bingha should always keep his head, that no situation could ever be made poorer by favoring thought before action. Not that Bingha himself felt in any way calm as he shoved his way forward until he could see Shizun again, this time being carried into a smaller side room by his martial brothers. That hadn't been a mere silencing curse. No, that had been far more and far, far worse. For all that Shen Qingqiu had never given Lu Bingha the answer he sought, the reason his disciple had been thrown away, Lu Bingha had a terrible feeling he might have learned the answer anyway. On a normal day, the side room served to hold petitioners waiting to be heard in the main hall. It was sparsely furnished, but at least contained a handful of gilded benches lining its walls. Lu Qingga laid Shen Qingqiu out on one of them, then stared as Yu Qingyuan knelt beside him with the outermost of his robes removed and folding it to place beneath Shen Qingqiu's head. For all that he was an immortal cultivator, Yu Qingyuan looked as though he had aged a decade in less than a shichen. His eyes were shadowed, and his smile was nowhere to be seen. Saying Men Shixian, Lu Qingga began, but he had no other words. This one knew that he had failed Shen Qingqiu, Yu Qingyan responded, almost to himself, yet this one had no understanding of how badly he was still failing him. He looked like a child, Lu Qingga said. At least as young as Shen Qingqiu, Shenju, had been when he had joined the sect. Lu Qingga thought he might have looked even younger than that. He looked like he did when this one last saw him. A woman said quietly from behind. When he turned, Chu Haitang was staring past them at the unconscious Shen Qingqiu. Lu Qingga was not subtle when he rose to stand between them. Explain, he said, aware of Yu Qingyuan moving to stand beside him. Lu Qingga had not needed assistance in appearing intimidating since he first picked up a sword as a child, but he would never turn away sect leader support when it came to defending Shen Qingqiu. To her credit, Chu Haitang did not quail for more than a moment before the two peak lords. The night after my family died, he looked like he did then, that same age. This one had not realized how small Xiaoju was back then. You do not call him that. A great killing intent bore down upon them, and the air fled their lungs. The intent was not directed at him. Lu Qingge chanced a glance. Yu Qingyuan's eyes burned as he stared the much smaller woman down. His hands were nowhere near his sword. Strangled squeak was all that escaped the shaking woman as she nodded her head in agreement. The killing intent slowly abated, and she backed away. A curse upon Peak Lord Shen since his childhood, and yet the eminent Kangqian mountain sect never detected it, came the old palace master's unwanted observation. For all that Lu Qingge had been raised to respect his elders, over the last month he had come to find that Huan Hua's leader reminded him of all the things that had irritated him about Shen Qingqiu before his Shixian's qi deviation. Except Shen Qingqiu, obviously, had been a kind, gentle, absolutely frustrating man beneath the detestable mask. Lu Qingge had no belief that the same could hold true for the old palace master. This master is ashamed to say it is so, and will take responsibility, Mu Qingfan said. His face was calm, but his shoulders were tense. No, Yu Qingyuan said without emotion. If it predates Shen Shixian entering the sect, then it was present before the An generation ascended. If even our teachers could not detect it, it is a miracle that it's been detected now. Kangqian Mountain Sect is grateful to Huanhua Palace for the boon of their artifacts. Lu Qingge was filled with gratitude that he had never been a politician. He wasn't even the one who had to say such a thing, and he felt ready to spit blood over it. Mushidi, what has been determined? Yu Qingyuan asked, turning his attention to the Peak Lord of Qiankao and pointedly away from Lao Gonzu. Mu Qingfan straightened, though his eyes were still deeply unhappy. Rather than a silencing spell or curse, it is a control curse with the secondary purpose of ensuring Shen Shixian's silence. Such a curse would be capable of control over both words and actions, potentially, at all times. The presence of a speech-compelling artifact on Shixian's person seems to have been enough to trip the secondary purpose, regardless of the questions being answered. The curse is at least primarily sentiment, or partially sentient, given that it identified the mirror as a threat to itself and lashed out. And lastly, at some point, Shen Shixian was in some small way able to loosen or even break free of the curse. The healer took up Shen Qingqiu's wrist yet again to examine the flow of his qi. Despite knowing with certainty that the curse exists and even how it affects Shen Shixian, this from one remains unable to sense it in any way. This Mu Qingfan has never heard of the like. Lu Qingge's scowl deepened. Who cursed him? If we can get information from that person, wouldn't that be faster? If violence was needed to extract that information, he was able and more than willing. Yu Qingyuan shook his head. Given what Hu Daoren has said regarding the destruction of her home and Shen Shixi's apparent age when the curse was applied, the timing implies that the culprit would be the demonic cultivator Wu Yanzi. He was said to have been particularly inventive with his cruelty, and more than once he was found to have used his cultivation to warp the minds of innocents. Lu Qingge stared at him expectantly until he continued. Wu Yanzi attempted to murder this one during the Immortal Alliance conference. Shen Qingqiu acted against Wu Yanzi to save this one's life, and in turn this one slew Wu Yanzi. Shen Shidi was brought directly to Kangqian after the conclusion of the conference. You think that Shen Qingqiu might have been under Wu Yanzi's control when the Qis were murdered. A reportedly drastic change in his personality around the same time he came into contact with such an infamous demonic cultivator. It would fit, said Mu Qingfan. The three Peak Lords shared a look, a long look. That certainly would have been the only time Shen Qingqiu's personality underwent such an extreme shift. What can we do, then? There was a cough behind them. "This master may have an idea," said the monk from Shaohua Temple. One moment. Shen Qingqiu returned to consciousness as if he was rising from the depths of a black lake. Slowly, clumsily, struggling to swim upward against the weight of layers of sodden robes and his ridiculously long hair. He knew, even before he opened his eyes, that unconsciousness would be preferred. His everything ached in a way it hadn't since before he'd first woken up as a cultivator, especially his head. Oh, someone please turn down the damn world. And he felt undeniably like he was being watched. Shen Qingqiu opened his eyes as little as he could get away with and still see. Yep, there they were, a dozen proud cultivators who had apparently been watching him creepily as he slept. Wu Qingfan, Yu Qingyuan, Lu Qingge, the old palace master, Chu Haitang, and there in the corner, one set of redwood eyes burning into Shen Qingqiu as though the Peak Lord were the only person in the room. Was that an improvement over the unpleasantness with coughing blood that Shen Qingqiu could recall happening before his little trip to Slumberland? Oh, he really couldn't decide. He wanted his fan, damn it. "How is Shen Shixian feeling?" Mu Qingfan asked, leaning over him. "Disturbed that others apparently find this one sleeping to be high entertainment. My head hurts abominably." He went still. What Shen Qingqiu had meant to say was, "This master is fine." That was not what had just come out of his mouth. What? "Ah," said a cultivator he didn't recognize in Shaohua robes, standing behind his fellow Peak Lords. "The torque of the unburdened heart is currently anchoring an array that should block the influence of all Qi on Peak Lord Shen. This one is afraid that removing the torque would also remove the effects of the array and allow the curse to affect him once again." Curse? What curse? Don't tell him he'd somehow gone and got himself cursed again, on top of everything else. A system. What the hell am I cursed with now? Couldn't be the sower's rash. Bingha's blood cured that already. As Shen Qingqiu ran through wife plots in his head. He hadn't interacted with any fairies or demons, besides Bingha, eaten anything unusual or anything at all, really, and his stomach felt ready to take up auto-cannibalism. The only artifact he'd come into contact with was the ridiculously named Torque. Had Bingha arranged for him to wear a cursed artifact at his own trial? Nothing happened for a long moment, then continued to happen. System? Crickets. System. What the fuck? If he stood up and moved to a different spot in the room, maybe Shen Qingqiu would get a better signal? There remained the distinct lack of a glowing window, shitty robotic voice, or even an irritating ding. Sorry. "The curse controlling Shen Shixian," said Mu Qingfan, tone heavy and eyes gently pained. The one that manifested as blue light and punished Shen Shixian for speaking. The sound of Shen Qingqiu's thoughts hitting the brakes was nearly audible scream. No, there was no way in hell they could not be talking about the system. Could they? His eyes must have widened beyond what Shen Qingqiu's baked-in poker face could suppress, because Yu Qingyuan leaned forward to rest a hand over his. "Shen Shidi does not need to be afraid to speak," he said. Were those tears in his eyes? "We will find a way to remove the curse from Shen Shidi so that it can never hurt him again." Zhangmen Shixian said it was such surety, the same surety as the sun rising in the east, and the weight of the entire Tiangong mountain range. Shen Qingqiu didn't believe it for a moment. Admittedly, he had no idea what the system actually was, but considering it had the ability to reach between worlds, power over souls, had swapped out the soul of one of their own peak lords without being detected, and, oh yeah, was powered by the protagonist, he wasn't exactly going to hold his breath. Please, Shixian, Mu Qingfan said, starting to reach for Shen Qingqiu's wrist out of sheer habit, only to abort the motion when he apparently remembered that the cultivator was currently isolated from all qi. We need your help to understand this curse. The silence was heavy as Shen Qingqiu thought furiously. The need to answer even Mu Shidi's indirect question was already rising, fueled by the damn torque. He was going to need to say something, but what? There was no way in hell he was going to be sharing the full sad story if he had anything to say. Nope, There was a one-way trip to either exorcism or outright execution. Please, Shizun. The thoughts tumbling over themselves in Shen Qingqiu's mind stumbled to a halt as Binghe stepped forward from the back of the pack of cultivators. That was definitely the sheen of tears right there in those big pleading eyes. Even as he watched, a tear overflowed to trail down that chiseled cheekbone to Binghe's strong jawline. What the fuck? Lua Binghe was the Black and Stallion protagonist now. What business did he have looking so damn much like Shen Qingqiu's little lost white sheep? The last time Shen Qingqiu had seen Lua Binghe cry had been at the edge of the endless abyss. It didn't feel any better to see it now. He had the idea that his sex siblings weren't particularly happy with Binghe's presence, but it wasn't like they were the important ones here. In fact, this whole setup, didn't it just reek of a cliche tell-all scene? Wife number 192 tearfully confessing in front of a dozen of her fellow wives how she had been tricked into betraying a palace weakness, and thus Lua Binghe, and then hidden it out of shame? Why did Shen Qingqiu keep getting all the damn wife plots? But even as he wanted to spit blood, if there was a chance, any at all, that Shen Qingqiu could give anything of the truth to Lua Binghe, didn't Binghe deserve it? Shizun, Binghe said, and his voice actually cracked. Shen Qingqiu wanted to say that the protagonist's acting abilities were beyond peer, but Binghe was pale, and something about him seemed small, almost defeated. If he was acting, bravo. Shen Qingqiu would hand him the award himself, but what if he wasn't? The spell-induced urge to respond could no longer be denied. Shen Qingqiu opened his mouth. It calls itself system. Okay, real quick, that's the end of chapter 1. So here are the notes. With Gong Yishao diverted to pick up the artifact, he never made it into the prison to give Shen Qingqiu his own replacement robe and try to help him escape. Shen Qingqiu was brought into the trial wearing Binghe's outer robe. This did not go unnoticed, but the most relevant reaction here was Zuzi Lang smelling another heavenly demon on his kindly cultivator and going, "What the fuck?" Besides, there's some high-quality drama going on. Tianling Jun is going to want all the deets. Per Fanon, there is a noted resemblance between Shen Qingqiu and Shen Yuan, and the difference most commonly included in fics are the eyes and the mouth. How convenient it is that here Reflection Shen Yuan's eyes are closed and his mouth is covered. No. I also headcanon that Shen Yuan only cut his hair whenever his Mei physically came to drag him out of his apartment to go get it done. At the point he died in this fic, she was overdue for one of those visits. And his sleeper was one of his Dagua's old plain t-shirts that had been washed a few too many times. Who cared what it looked like? It was comfortable. Inspiration for the story goes in equal parts to chrysalis eaters. Honesty is such a lonely word, and Kairan Odulib hears, and judgment is just like a cup that we share. I am so sorry to those authors. I think I completely butchered their names. I apologize. Credit to O.O. Jane Blonde for the use of on for the previous generation of Peak Lords. Chapter 2. Real quick, I'm going to take another sip of tea. Shen Qingqiu opened his mouth. It calls itself system, he said, and couldn't control the automatic flinch, just waiting for points to be removed, or worse. Probably worse. Yu Qingyuan's grip tightened on his hand. The room collectively exhaled in relief as nothing happened. The suppressing array was working. Could he really speak freely? Well, mostly freely. The torque would still keep him telling the truth, whether he liked it or not, but if he recalled correctly, the torque wasn't absolutely infallible. So long as Shen Qingqiu was careful, maybe he could work with this, remove a few of those pesky death flags from his person. This master would like to sit up, he said quietly, thinking hard, and perhaps something to drink to rid his mouth of the taste of blood. Yu Qingyuan and Mu Qingfan nearly got in each other's way to help him sit up until he could lean back against the wall, his feet on the floor. Lu Qingge was the one to produce a small flask of water, no doubt accustomed to the need to carry one on his night hunts. Once Shen Qingqiu had been situated, the monk from Shaohua Temple stepped forward once again. As the torque of the unbidden heart retains its original function, this master believes that the issue of the trial should be resolved quickly so that Qingqian Mountain Sect may devote its efforts to the dissolution of Peak Lord Shen's curse. Agreed, said the old palace master, though Shen Qingqiu thought he detected a touch of disgruntlement. No doubt, all this mess wasn't going towards whatever his, or Binghe's, plan was. Even if Qingqian had lost face from needing Huanhua Palace's assistance with their own Peak Lord. Peak Lord Shen Qingqiu, you are accused of setting sower demons upon Jinlan City. How does Peak Lord Shen answer? This master was not responsible for the presence or actions of the sowers in Jinlan City. The old palace master's lips tightened. As Peak Lord Shen is not currently capable of such a direct lie, the charge is formally dropped. The second charge now. Was Peak Lord Shen responsible for the murders of the Chu family and household? Shen Qingqiu thought quickly, even as his throat tightened. He knew what the book had said, of course. But really, even if Airplane Bro hadn't admitted, the world seemed to follow his unwritten drafts almost as often as the published version. Didn't the original trial consist of mostly hearsay or decades-old testimony from a traumatic experience? Did he really know absolutely 100% for sure? Really. The question was unclear. Was the palace master referring to him, Shen Qingqiu, or to the original goods? This master is unable to answer that question with confidence, he finally said, and thankfully it came out as he meant it to. Ha! Reframing his thoughts ahead of time seemed to work just fine. There were frowns all around, though most were puzzled as opposed to Lao Gonzu's frown of irritation. What does Peak Lord Shen mean by his answer? Oh, that one was easy, and now he could fill in a nice plot hole, too. This master's first memory in this life is of waking in his home on Qingjing Peak some 6 years ago. Zhangmen Shixian and the system were both present. Thingman Shixian said this one had been very ill. The Shen Qingqiu is unable to reliably answer questions about events that occurred before that point, except with knowledge obtained from other parties, and cannot testify as to whether that knowledge is accurate to real life. Yu Qingyuan closed his eyes in pained understanding. Shen Shidi truly lost his memories then, he said. This master had wondered, but was afraid to ask. Shen Qingqiu filled in for him. Ha! First plot hole cleared. No more veiled and deeply awkward hints at their shared past. Yu Qingyuan turned to Chu Haitang, who had been watching Shen Qingqiu with an astonishing lack of hatred in her gaze. Is Chu Dairen satisfied regarding the matter of her family? Yes. This humble one is satisfied that the man responsible for her family's deaths is dead himself and beyond any further retribution. Well, true. Very true. The original Goods was dead, assuming he was responsible, and this poor transmigrator certainly wasn't the guilty party. The woman bowed to the gathering. This Chu Haitang formally withdraws her charges against Peak Lord Shen. Her gaze on him was conflicted, and she hesitated. This one wonders whether Shenju has ever truly been free, the lady said, almost more to herself than to him. Not waiting for an answer, she shook her head and, straight-backed, left the room. 2 for 2! Shen Qingqiu was dropping death flags like flies. Lu Ganzu's beady eyes were narrowed. The final accusation is that Peak Lord Shen abused his disciples. How does Peak Lord Shen answer? Yes. That. The one accusation that truly belonged to Shen Qingqiu. He dearly wished for a fan to hide behind as he met Binghe's intent eyes. In the years he recalls, this master has not abused his disciples. However, he has caused undeserved harm to his personal disciple, Liu Binghe. A flicker of satisfaction crossed Old Palace Master's face. Peak Lord Shen admits guilt, then. Shizun bowed his head, and Binghe absolutely could not stand the resigned slump of his frame. Wait! He cried, ignoring the looks he received, especially the glare from Liu Qingge. Shizun, Binghe said, stepping forward and speaking quickly. When Shizun injured and banished this one at the Immortal Alliance conference, was it because System made Shizun do it? Shizun's dark eyes were on Binghe, and it felt like forever before his lovely lips parted. Yes and no. Shizun? At the Immortal Alliance conference, System offered this master a choice. In the years since that moment, this one has somewhat come to believe that he made the wrong choice. Binghe felt frozen on his feet. This was it. He was going to get his answer. And then he could forgive Shizun. Really, he'd already mostly forgiven Shizun. All his heart had needed was a good excuse, and being controlled by a curse surely had to count. They could both move on. Together. What choice was Shizun given? Shen Qingqiu closed his eyes. This master could harm Liu Binghe in that way, or System would strip this master's soul from his body. No. That, unwillingly, his mind imagined a world without Shizun in it. Of Shizun collapsing to the ground, dead in a moment or worse, his body still breathing and his eyes empty. Shizun made the right choice, Binghe said, and his voice sounded thin and distant to his own ears. He thought maybe he heard other people shouting around him. Black spots seemed to cloud the edges of his vision, and he swayed on his feet. Oh, Binghe's blood wasn't reaching his head correctly. He sent a quick command to his blood Jiu to fix it, but the terror of what could have happened yet lingered. What? Shen Qingqiu said, his voice the only thing Binghe could hear clearly. Shock was unusually visible on his face. But I hurt Binghe. What Shizun did hurt. Lu Binghe absolutely agreed, still wrestling to balance out his blood pressure. It hurt for years, but it didn't hurt as much as losing Shizun would have. Because really, wasn't that what had hurt the most? Thinking that Binghe had lost his beloved Shizun because of the filthy blood that ran through his veins. A hand grabbed his wrist, and Binghe only just stopped himself from lashing out at the interloper. Breathe, Shizzy, Wu Qingfan told him sternly, and a flow of neutral, tepid-feeling qi flooded his meridians and brought with it an artificial sense of calm. As soon as he felt he could, Binghe pulled away from the unpleasant feeling, and Mu Shishu let him with only a single raised eyebrow as commentary. Shizun watched him with naked concern, and Binghe felt something within him settle at the sign of Shizun's care. Shizun didn't hate him. Shizun hadn't wanted to hurt him. This disciple refuses to press charges, he said loudly, interrupting the furious argument going on in the rest of the room. Shizun was clearly under duress. Agreed, Yu Qingyuan said instantly. The designated neutral party, the monk from Shaohuai, nodded in agreement. Which means this trial is over and the remaining matter of Shen Shidi's curse is of relevance only to Qingqian Mountain Sect, which will, of course, compensate Huanhua Palace for the use of its artifacts and the unfortunate loss of its scrying mirror, he continued before the old palace master could object. Lao Gonzu gathered his remaining dignity around himself and nodded. Very well. This master expects that Qingqian will share details of the curse once it is resolved for our records. Of course. With no further excuse to remain, the old palace master swept from the room to deliver the verdict to the crowd of spectators left outside, accompanied by the master from Shaohua Temple as witness. Oh, good. I'm sorry, Shen Qingqiu told Yu Qingyuan too quietly for anyone else, even with cultivator hearing, to listen in. System offered to give me the memories that were lost, but only if I paid a price. This one, I wasn't willing to pay it. Yu Qingyuan pressed his hands. Shen Qingqiu has nothing to apologize for, he said firmly. Who knows what this foul system would have demanded from his dearest person. This one knew something was wrong, but did not press when he should have, and Shen Shidi suffered for it. Shen Qingqiu shook his head. This one wouldn't have been able to answer if something had been noticed and questions were asked. System wouldn't have allowed its secrecy to be jeopardized. This Shen Qingqiu cannot imagine any result of an investigation that would not have resulted in execution, imprisonment, or at best, exile from the sect. Never. His hands tightened over his Shidi's fingers until he remembered himself. Had Shen Qingqiu truly lived in such fear during his time on the mountain? Yu Qingyuan couldn't stand the thought of it, or that he hadn't noticed and alleviated that fear. You're still here? He heard Lu Qingge demand loudly and turned. Lu Binghe had not followed the rest from the room. Yes, this disciple has something to ask Shizun, the young man said, with a quick glare at the Bison Peak Lord before his attention returned, inevitably, to Shen Qingqiu. Then ask it and get out, Lu Qingge barked. Lu Shidi, Shen Qingqiu scolded his martial brother before turning to his former student. What is it, Binghe? Lu Binghe seemed to brighten at being addressed so familiarly, before dropping to his knees before his master. Yu Qingyuan had never quite approved of this suggestion of intimacy between the two, but he supposed that without his past memories, the boy had been the person who spent the most time around Shen Qingqiu and was therefore his closest person. The cultivator pushed down the burn of his jealousy at the thought. It was his own fault that position did not rest in his hands both before and now. Shizun cast this one away under duress, Liu Binghe said, and this one did not willingly leave Kangqian or Qingjing Peak. Would Shizun be willing to allow this one as his disciple again? That is something Binghe would want, Shen Qingqiu said with some astonishment, looking down at the kneeling cultivator. Yu Qingyuan was surprised at his surprise. Didn't Qingqiu Shidi understand how devoted to him his disciple had been? Even from another peak, the stories of the lengths the boy had gone to for his master were rampant. But I hurt him so badly. How could Binghe trust that this inadequate teacher won't hurt him again? When Shizun is able to choose, Shizun chooses to be kind. To this Liu Binghe, to the other disciples, even to the stranger Shizun meets down the mountain. Even if Shizun has to hurt him again, this disciple won't hold it against him because he knows the cruelty won't be Shizun's. Yu Qingyuan found himself nodding in agreement, giving one more squeeze to the delicate hands in his before he forced himself to let them go. Luo Shizi is not wrong, he said, knowing without doubt that his Shidi would accept his disciple back. Shen Qingqiu's despondent behavior after the Immortal Alliance conference made a great deal of sense now that Yu Qingyuan understood the context of being forced to betray a personal disciple in such a way. He could not imagine his Shidi choosing to spurn the boy of his own free will, and perhaps the return of his disciple would help Shen Qingqiu to finally heal. Shen Xixian has grown to be kind. Shen Xixian's health has worsened since Luo Shizi was lost, Mu Qingfan added, ignoring Shen Qingqiu's betrayed glare. This master understands that without Luo Shizi's care, Shen Xixian is relied almost entirely upon Inedia, sleeps poorly and spends hours at a time at a memorial he built for Luo Shizi. Shizun! Liu Binghe cried. At the same moment, Shen Qingqiu hissed, Mu Shidi! Actual tears glimmered in the boy's eyes as the healer smiled tranquilly at his martial brother. Yu Qingyuan understood completely. All was fair in love in getting Shen Qingqiu to take proper care of himself. This disciple will cook Shizun a feast once we get home, Lu Shizi promised, his pleading eyes wide until Shen Qingqiu pressed a hand to his face and groaned. Fine. Binghe is, of course, welcome on Qingjing Peak. This master just thought that Binghe might have gained other responsibilities since then. Liu Binghe beamed at him, nearly puppyish in his manifest joy. Nothing is more important than Shizun's health. This disciple will manage. The two of them stared at each other for a long moment, and Yu Qingyuan felt himself truly smile for the first time since before Shen Qingqiu's arrest by Huanhua Palace. If that's all done with, can we get on with the breaking of that damned curse? Mu Qingge interrupted, scowling at the lot of them, and especially at Liu Binghe. Mu Qingfan coughed. Of course. He quickly pulled supplies from his sleeve in order to take notes. Shen Xixian, you said that system was there after your fever and what we had believed to be a severe qi deviation. Can you tell us more about what occurred that day? Shen Qingqiu closed his eyes in concentration. This master woke in the bamboo house on Qingjing Peak. System spoke and told me I existed for a purpose. It said that there were rules, that if this one did not obey the rules, system would administer punishment. Yu Qingyuan felt his smile freeze. Punishment? With a sympathetic gaze towards his sect leader, Mu Shidi pushed onward. Did system tell Shen Xixian what its purpose is? What is the goal of this curse? Shen Qingqiu hesitated. What is the goal of this curse? Shen Qingqiu hesitated for just a moment. To create entertainment. And what it finds to be the most entertaining seems to be drama and conflict. Its actions could be framed as the intent to ensure that times are interesting ones, he said, his lips twisting briefly in bitter amusement at paraphrasing the hoary old malediction. Wu Qingfan wrote furiously, his characters illegible to any but himself or any of the healers he trained. Sometimes Yu Qingyuan wondered to himself whether they weren't normal characters at all, and Qian Peak had developed its own unbreakable code. And what rules did System make Shen Qingqiu follow? This master was never to speak of or even hint at System's existence. This master was to complete the tasks it assigned him, and this master was to act in certain ways and not act in others. What ways? Lu Qingge demanded. His eyes were narrowed, as though he had formed a theory and was waiting for the pieces to fall into place. This master was to treat others with coldness at best and cruelty at worst. At the beginning, whenever this one tried to act otherwise, System threatened to inflict penalties. The same way you acted before your fever, Lu Qingge said, both bitter anger and understanding in his eyes. He and Shen Qingqiu had been at odds for so many years. Yu Qingyuan could only imagine it rankled even worse now for Lu Shidi to know that the one he had fought with so bitterly by all rights should instead have been taken under his protection. To alienate those around you, give them cause to find conflict with you. Because that's what it wanted. Conflict. Shen Qingqiu hummed. What this one has heard of his past behavior would have left him with few allies and fewer friends within the sect or without, and making it less likely System's presence would be discovered, Yu Qingyuan concluded, furious with himself. For more than 2 decades, he had just taken Shen Qingqiu's behavior on its face, because wasn't it understandable that his most important person would be cold and bitter and angry after everything that had happened to him? After his Qi Gua abandoned him through his own stupidity and hubris? Yet Shen Qingqiu has not acted in this way in years. Could Qingqiu tell this one what changed? Wu Qingfan pressed. Qingqiu Shidi nodded. For a time after awakening, this one tried to comply with System's wishes, though not always well. But the punishments that System levied on this one for lapses in behavior were not the same as the ones threatened for breaking his silence or failing his tasks. Had the Qi deviations been the event that partially freed Shen Qingqiu from his curse's shackles? His Shidi had had so many Qi deviations over the years. Had he been battling against the curse so fiercely that he broke himself again and again as others looked down upon his weaker cultivation? Shizun speaks of the threat to steal his soul, Lu Shizi said, scowling fiercely. And Yu Qingyuan found himself momentarily distracted. Had the young man's eyes always been that particularly reddish shade of brown? Yes. Shortly after awakening, this one discovered that he was nearly free to act as he wished outside of the tasks System gave him. System did not like it and caused many problems, but this one did not wish to act like the man others told him he had been. The stubborn glint in his eyes was familiar and comforting to Yu Qingyuan. Xiao Ju had always resented being told what to do. The mission to investigate the murders in Shuanghu City when this disciple was 14, Louis Binghe said with a look of great realization. Shizun had already been acting differently before then, but it was after the death of the demon that Shizun truly... Binghe was correct. Despite his confirmation, disgruntlement flickered over Shen Qingqiu's expression. Even if that mission hardly went according to plan... Lu Qingge flushed brilliantly and looked away. Shidi? Yu Qingyuan asked, suddenly worried. It had been Shen Qingqiu's first mission off the mountain since his Qi deviation, so of course Yu Qingyuan had paid close attention to the mission completion report. Yet he recalled no mention of the mission going awry. Just that the third concubine had unfortunately already been killed and replaced before the arrival of Shen Qingqiu and his disciples. The demon had been successfully slain without further casualties. This one mentioned that System often caused problems for this master. Those problems generally took the form of either placing this master in nonsensical and dangerous situations, We're arranging for this master's humiliation through wardrobe malfunctions at inopportune times. Shen Qingqiu's ears had gone a brilliant pink, and the look on his face dared them to ask further on the topic and reap the consequences. Luo Binghe glanced at once at the black robe his master was wearing, then buried his face in his hands with a quiet whimper. Shidi reached out to gingerly pat the boy on the head. Part of Yu Qingyuan, a small part, wanted to know. The rest of him was quite certain that any further inquiry would not be worth Shen Qingqiu's inevitable retribution. Shen Qingqiu coughed. This one doesn't suppose Lu Shidi would have... my thanks to Lu Shidi, he said, eagerly accepting a fan from the martial cultivator and snapping it open to hide his reddening face. Would Shen Shixian agree that the system has the ability to cause him misfortune in general, similar to a bad luck curse? Mu Qingfan asked, without looking up from his notes, ignoring the awkward moment. He nodded cautiously. That sounds somewhat plausible, though this master would not say that it was specifically a bad luck curse. Of course. Has Shen Shixian noticed any other abilities System has that he can share? This master once tricked System into breaking an undamaged ceiling beam at an opportune moment. Lu Binghe looked up sharply at that, and it has in the past restricted this master's speech beyond keeping silent about System itself. Mu Shidi set yet another sheet of paper aside for the ink to dry. He was developing quite a stack. In what way? Shen Qingqiu's eyes narrowed behind his fan. In a specific situation, it would offer scripted options for this master to speak and require this one to choose between them. Rather than speak System's words, this master chose to stay silent. He looked down at his disciple, still kneeling on the floor. I did regret it, but what it wanted me to say to you was intolerable to me. Luo Binghe reached out to take his master's free hand and pressed it to his forehead. This one understands and requests Shizen's punishment for his actions. Yu Qingyuan stared hard at the boy. And what actions would that be, exactly? Shen Qingqiu lowered his fan enough for his adamant expression to be seen. No, Binghe. System was manipulating the situation. It has always targeted Binghe for undeserved pain. That was no different. System was particularly focused on Lu Shidi. Does Shen Shixian know why? Shen Qingqiu blinked once, slowly. This master believes it saw Binghe as a particular source of the entertainment it desired. The Immortal Alliance Conference was far from the first time its requirements would have sowed further conflict between us. There was something Qingqiu Shidi wasn't saying. Yu Qingyuan knew that cat-like blink of old. Before he could interject, though, his Shidi was continuing. Binghe had originally been given a cultivation manual that would have crippled his growth as a cultivator. As soon as he knew he could, this master gave him a better manual and disposed of the other one. There was a fierce light in Shen Qingqiu's eyes. It was the first time this one succeeded in diverging from the long-term plan System seemed to be following. Lu Binghe was listening, wide-eyed, clinging to his master's hand with both of his like it was his only anchor. Yu Qingyuan suspected that if no other peak lords had been present, the boy would have been hugging Shen Qingqiu's lap like a distraught child. He supposed Lu Shidi was still quite young at that, and listening to how oneself was a target of such a malicious entity could not be at all pleasant. Shen Shidi has succeeded many times, Yu Qingyuan said with utter certainty. Shen Qingqiu was the tactician of Kangqian Mountain Sect for a reason. If there was anyone who could outwit such a dreadful curse, it was he. Will Shidi tell us when? It would be good to know what plans may yet need disrupting. Shen Qingqiu hummed to himself and closed his fan with a brisk snap. System required that this master spend most of a year in seclusion after the mission in Shuanghu City. During that time, he was meant to encounter Lu Shidi during Shidi's chi deviation and, I suspect, fail to save him. It meant for me to die, Lu Qingqiu said, scowling. Not that he had ceased to scowl at any time during the proceedings. It was without a doubt a deeper scowl now. Shidi's death, given the bad history between us, would have been blamed on this master and used as an irrefutable charge at his trial. Shen Qingqiu's lips quirked as he gestured towards his neck with the fan. Irrefutable, bearing the use of a truth-enforcing artifact, anyway. That was not expected at all. Yu Qingyuan felt his eyes widen. Shidi knew of the trial beforehand. This master was to be accused of Lu Shidi's murder, the murders of the Chu household, abusing his disciples, as well as lechery. Shen Qingqiu's nose wrinkled at the last charge listed. Indeed, Yu Qingyuan hadn't heard of a single visit to the warm red pavilion at the base of the mountain since Shidi's chi deviation. He felt ill at the thought that System might have forced those past visits as well. How many more indignities would it be found out that Xiaoju had suffered alone? After his trial, this master was to be sentenced to the water prison to face justice from those wronged. The brief flicker of his eyes towards his disciple was almost unnoticeable. Almost. Lu Binghe's face crumpled, and after an unspecified number of years, this one would pass away. No, Yu Qingyuan said, horrified. I wouldn't let... Zhangmen Shixian would die attempting to rescue this master. Shen Qingqiu interrupted him almost gently. I have known this for years. How? Lu Qingqiu demanded. Zhangmen Shixian is the strongest cultivator alive. A trap. One that would allow quantity to overcome even the highest quality. So, Qi Gua would have failed Xiaoju again, and due to his recklessness, again. Yu Qingyuan forcibly settled his qi that wanted to roil in his spirit veins, though made his meridians ache. Now was not the time to have a deviation. Even if this Qi Gua was useless, Xiaoju might have need of what little he had to offer. Shizhen knows that this one would never. Lu Binghe's eyes were wet again. Shen Qingqiu sighed and put his fan down on the bench beside him. Once free, his hand went straight to the top of his disciple's head. This master understands Binghe perhaps a little better now than he did before, he said quietly, though he still feels Binghe should be angry with this one. Lu Binghe shook his head violently. No, never. This disciple is angry at this system, not Shizhen. He snuck a resentful glance at the three Peak Lords, however. Yu Qingyuan could not blame him. For all that the Peak Lords claimed to be martial family, they had utterly failed to recognize that Shen Qingqiu even needed their aid, let alone offered it. Shen Shixian has not spoken a word of without a cure, Mu Qingfen said, breaking his silence in attention to his note-taking. Was the infliction of that poison also because of system? No. This master simply moved without thinking. Shen Qingqiu looked away, his ears pink. Though, given how often the poison flares at precisely the worst or most traumatic moment, this master believes the system is able to trigger the condition whenever it desires. And it was system that required this master to send Binghe out. This one knew that Binghe would win his fight, but I did not want to watch Binghe be hurt in the process. Yet again, system required something from Shen Shidi in regards to Lu Binghe, Yu Qingyuan said slowly. Why? The boy was just a disciple. Even taking relatively few personal students, Shen Qingqiu had a few dozen disciples to which system could have turned its attention. What made this one so special? Why such focus on him? This one knows Shen Shidi has already given an answer, but not a complete one, he said quickly as Shen Qingqiu opened his mouth to speak. The Peak Lord knew he was right when Qingqiu Shidi's mouth closed with a nearly audible click, and his face went a little too still. The room was silent for a dozen heartbeats before a flicker of pain crossed Shen Qingqiu's face, and Yu Qingyuan recalled belatedly that his Shidi was still wearing a speech-compelling artifact. Liu Binghe looked up at his master with a panicked expression. "A system has a connection with Binghe," Shen Qingqiu admitted slowly. "Shizun?" The Peak Lord sighed. "The relationship between them, it is parasitic in nature. System draws power from Liu Binghe to sustain itself." The boy went completely still. For a long moment, Liu Qingyuan wasn't even sure he was breathing. "Shizun," he said, obviously thinking hard. "If this disciple were to die, would System die with this lowly one? Or would it jump to another to steal power from?" "Absolutely not!" Shen Qingqiu snapped, reaching out to snag his disciple by the ear. "Liu Binghe is absolutely forbidden to die for this master." Yu Qingyuan quickly wiped the thoughtful expression from his own face. They would have to be absolutely certain System would die with Liu Shizi before acting, of course, but a livid Shen Qingqiu was better than a dead or cursed Shen Qingqiu, and it didn't seem like the boy was unwilling. "But Shizun," Liu Shizi protested despite the pain from his mastered, white-knuckled, pinching fingers. "Shizun's life and freedom are definitely more important than this disciple's worthless life. Shizun should know this. That's why it was all right when System made Shizun try to kill this one." Shen Qingqiu instantly looked downright enraged. "Who tried to kill Binghe? This master never did. I knew Binghe could survive the Endless Abyss, or I never would have done it." "What? The Endless Abyss? Your disciple went into the Endless Abyss when the rift opened and survived?" Liu Shidi said, bewildered. "How? He was a disciple." Wu Qingfan sighed, shuffled the pages of his copious notes with a single stack. "This master would assume Liu Shizi's survival was due to his remarkably strong demonic heritage," he stated, as calmly as if he were remarking on the weather. "What?" And then the author left a bunch of ha-ha faces. "This is my shower fic, as in the fic where ideas and scenes inconveniently harass me in the moments when I am least able to write them down and get them out of my head. Which is why there is suddenly a third chapter planned. I was ambushed. Most of this fic is from non-Shenyuan point of view because that's not something I see done very often, and I enjoy it. In fact, where have you ever seen any Shen Qingqiu Liu Binghe reconciliation from a third party's point of view? Here, that's where. Not because trying to write from outside of Shenyuan's brain makes my head hurt. Nope, not at all. That's my story and I'm sticking to it." Shenju's actions were those of a traumatized man who had opportunities to make good choices, but whose ability to make said good choices was sabotaged by said trauma. But when you think about it, that's an awful lot of misfortune and bad coincidences to all happen to one street rat. Makes you wonder if that wasn't the system right there, making sure that all the right bad things happened to him to shape him into the person the plot needed him to be. My utter least favorite thing about this fic? Chu Jianluo doesn't get the skeletons dragged out of his closet and his name dragged through the mud. Agreed. All right. One quick sip, then chapter 3. Chapter 3. The only thing faster than Liu Qingge's hand going to the hilt of his sword was Shizun shooting to his feet, grasping Binghe by the collar of his robes and pulling the young man behind him so that he stood between Binghe and his martial uncle. Shizun then swayed like the bamboo of his Qingjing peak, his currently poor health, inedia, In Edia, for years, the water prison with his cultivation blocked, and then the curse's punishments on top of all that. Shizu, no! Catching up to him with a sudden movement. Bingha rushed to catch him with a gasp, only just beating out the other 3 men in the room to guide the wilting Shen Qingqiu back down to sit on the bench. Shixian, really, Wu Qingfan huffed. He took Shizun's wrist to feel for his pulse and check the dilation of his pupils. This is no time to act rashly, all of you. Lu Shizi's heritage is relevant to the matter of breaking the curse, not for any judgment of his person. But he's a demon, Lu Qingga protested fiercely. He possesses demonic heritage, the doctor corrected, distracted by the Qingjing Peak Lord attempting to wave him away irritably with a trembling hand. If this master had a spirit stone for every disciple that has ever come through Tiankao Peak with some degree of demonic, fairy, or spirit ancestry, King Qian Mountain Sect would be richer than Huanhua Palace. This one's master even theorized that non-human ancestry promoted a greater capacity to cultivate. Wu Qingfan paused for a moment. Admittedly, he theorized this very quietly. Such a thought would have not been welcome amidst the wider realm. This master has heard a similar theory before, though it was indeed unpopular, Shen Qingqiu agreed. Bingha didn't like the touch of breathiness in his voice. The immortal binding cables could not be fully removed from Shizun until the curse was broken, woven as they were into the suppressing array anchored by the torque of the unburdened heart. But the medical care Shizun could receive was limited without the option of transferring qi. Bingha didn't even dare touch the blood jiu still in Shizun's body. And this one has known his disciple was of mixed blood for as long as he has been aware of Lu Bingha's existence. Bingha blinked back tears, feeling his heart swell in his chest, as if he needed further confirmation that Shizun's rejection at the edge of the endless abyss had been the work of the system, that Shizun truly did not condemn him for his blood. Shizun tried to protect him, placed his delicate body between Bingha and his own martial brothers. Even if such a protection would only have worked because Lu Qingga and Yu Qingyuan were perhaps the only men in the world as unwilling to harm Shen Qingqiu as Bingha himself was. And Wu Qingfan, the most respected doctor in the Jianghu, didn't hold his blood against him either. That was support from a most unexpected corner. Bingha instantly promoted him to the status of second favorite Peak Lord, even if Mu Shishu had committed the egregious sins of neither being able to cure Shizun without a cure, nor recognizing Shizun was under a curse for years and years. The other Peak Lords had simply set the bar that low. Oops, wrong way. Speaking of, Lu Qingga had yet to remove his hand from his sword, and sect leader's eyes on Bingha were narrowed, assessing. Careful not to make it obvious that his attention was on either of them, Bingha sank to one knee next to his master with Shinmo tucked out of sight at his side, a position carefully calculated to make him look less of a threat while still allowing him to move quickly if violence were to break out. It was much easier to convince someone that you were harmless and then to show your dangerous side if needed than to take back a perilous first impression. Just because the same plot hadn't worked when Bingha first met Shizun in Jinlan City didn't make it any less true. Oh, if System had convinced Shizun that Bingha would hurt him, even if it had been right, didn't that just explain so much of how poorly the reunion between master and disciple had gone? Lu Bingha had learned so much in the last half Shichen that his thoughts wanted to tumble over themselves like leaves in a whirlwind. He was almost grateful for the potential threat Lu Qingga and Yu Qingyuan posed to him. Amongst other things, the endless abyss had taught him how to concentrate his mind on the present. Survival required the ability to put troublesome thoughts aside until after danger had passed, or at least to let them wait for their moment when he was only mildly in peril. The important thing now was freeing Shizun from his chains. Everything else could come later. Even so, the keening at the back of his mind was never quite stopped. Shizen's ropes had torn to shreds in his hands. System had done that, had humiliated Shizen, made him vulnerable in the way in front of Bingha. Just what had System expected Bingha to do to Shizen? Knowing he was a demon, has demon blood, whatever, you still allowed him into the sect? Into your own home? Luchinga demanded, aghast. Shizen had snatched his fan back up from the bench beside him and now deployed it in front of his face. His eyes glistened over the spread leaves of the fan, painted with an austere scene of mountains shrouded in clouds. Lushidi knew that the master cannot answer regarding the events of Bingha's acceptance into the sect. As for bringing him into this master's home, everyone deserves to have a place they feel safe. He paused for a moment. That is discounting that it was scripted for Bingha to turn against this master in this sect, deservedly so for the abysmal treatment heaped upon him. Even if Bingha's presence in this master's life were not the greatest source of happiness he has ever known, spiting the system alone would have been more than worth it. Shen Qingqiu went still, blinked, then blanched, ducking his face to fully hide behind the fan as though he had said more than he meant to. Lu Bingha reeled. Shizen said, the greatest source. Shizen, he whispered, overwhelmed. Shizen is the greatest source of this Bingha's happiness. Intentional confession. Cute. Bingha wanted to kiss it, to feel the heat of his master's embarrassment against his lips, and all his other emotions besides. The heat of his master's embarrassment against his lips, and all his other emotions besides. Maybe, someday maybe, if Bingha kept making Shizen happy, Shizen might even let him. The bare embers of hope that he had nursed all through the endless abyss, that had faded even further in Jinland City, the water prison, flared to full, effulgent life once more. It burst into flames. We'll just say it burst into flames. Yu Qingyuan coughed, drawing eyes back towards him. His own gaze remained on Shizen, something heavy and soft and regretful in them all at the same time. This master trusts that Lu Bingha is loyal to his Shizen, he said. If Bingha were not still floating on a cloud, he would have been tempted to roll his eyes. Was it really necessary to state the blindingly obvious? All other considerations can be discussed once the curse on Shen Shidi has been broken. The Shen Qingqiu is in agreement and would like very much to get out of this accursed piece of jewelry off his neck sometimes before the next century, Shizen snapped, face still hidden from view. Luchinga looked unhappy but subsided, though he was still glaring with suspicious eyes. Lu Bingha hardly cared so long as he would not need to fight his martial uncles right this very moment. Mu Qingfan coughed. In that vein, this one apologizes for bringing up what he suspects to be a particularly traumatic event, but he must ask precisely what occurred at the Immortal Alliance conference where Lu Shizi was lost. Shizen's free hand twitched at his side, and when Bingha grasped it with his own, he wasn't sure if it was to comfort Shizen or himself. Perhaps it was both. System gave this master a task, Shen Qingqiu began, lowering the fan back to his chin. He made an attempt to flutter it, as if unconcerned, but gave it up quickly when he couldn't control the tremor in his hand. This one knew about it for long before the event, but no matter what attempt was made to bargain, System refused to consider either the task or the penalty for failing it. Lu Bingha would have his demonic blood revealed, at the worst possible moment at that, and in response, this master was to force him into the endless abyss, in order to... He hesitated, glancing in Bingha's direction. Please, Shizen, Bingha said quietly. This lowly one knows Shizen wants to protect him, but information withheld now might mean Shizen continues to suffer under System. We need to know, even if it hurts this disciple. Shen Qingqiu's lips pressed together in a thin line. in order for Lu Binghe to find and retrieve the sword Sinmo. Binghe froze. The sword on his belt seemed to burn, a line of cold fire against his side. He had thought Sinmo to be a fortuitous find, a way to escape the endless abyss and find a way back to his beloved side. The ways that grated at his senses and added fuel to his stronger emotions were just the price such a powerful artifact demanded for its use. But if he was meant to find the blade, if System wanted him to have it. Gingerly and a bit awkwardly, as he was still kneeling on the floor, Lu Binghe used 2 fingers to maneuver the sheathed sword off his belt and slide it as far away from him as he could reach. Of the other cultivators, only Yu Qingyuan wore an expression of any recognition as he stared at the abandoned blade. This master recalls that Sinmo is a legendary demonic sword, but can call to mind little of the particulars, he admitted. Sinmo is more than a legendary sword. It is possibly the most powerful weapon ever known to either the human or demonic realms, Shizun corrected, falling into the cadence he favored while lecturing disciples without any apparent notice. It can cut through anything, including space and possibly time, as they are much the same thing, and greatly amplifies the natural strength and demonic arts of its wielder. Its power is matched only by its greed. It constantly demands a high price in yin energy, and if the price is not met through either slaughter or other means, it is known to consume its wielders in an instant. And even when that price is actively being met, unless it is mastered, Sinmo will inflame its wielder's heart demons until the wielder's eventual self-destruction, hence its name. Elder Meng Mo had warned Binghe about Shinmo, but his warnings had been more along the lines of being cautious with the sword while he used it to conquer the demon realm. Binghe was going to have a talk with the Dream Demon the next time he slept about what constituted a proper warning. Sinmo's ability to cut through space in particular is the only reliable way this master knows of to exit the endless abyss, barring the personal ability to teleport or create portals exhibited by some demonic species, Shizun continued. Once Binghe was in the endless abyss, it was really his only way of leaving it again. Although it was expected that Binghe would take the whole of 5 years before finding it and managing to escape, this master should have expected Binghe to excel. Even with his skin still crawling at the thought of how closely Binghe had been adhering to the system's plan, from Zenmo all the way to cooperating at Huanhua Palace, put Shizun to trial, he managed a shaky smile towards his beloved. How could this disciple of Shizun's dare to do any less? Lu Shizi, if this master may, Mu Qingfan asked, approaching him with an outstretched hand. Binghe reluctantly let the doctor take his wrist. He didn't really care for the lukewarm feeling of his martial uncle's qi, he decided, as Mu Shishu spent several minutes carefully examining his meridians and poking carefully at the demonic energy burning side by side with the weaker flow of his spiritual qi. Shizun's qi was far superior, the crisp, refreshing sensation of a mountain stream's icy water against strained muscles after a long day. A longing rose up in him, as if it had been a lifetime since Binghe had last experienced that cool, gentle feeling. Lu Shizi's qi is becoming unbalanced towards yang, as Shen Qingqiu suggested, Mu Qingfan finally said with a small frown. But the imbalance is not nearly as advanced as this one had feared. How long has it been since Lu Binghe was able to take in yin to satiate Shinmo? Binghe cast his thoughts back, taking into account what Shizun had told him about the accursed sword. When this one first exited the endless abyss, Sinmo's portal left him at the far edge of the demon realm from the borderlands. Reaching the borderlands required fighting through every demon or minor chieftain who objected to this one crossing their territory. If Sinmo feeds on bloodshed, then there was a great deal of that. Shen Qingqiu looked visibly puzzled. A bloodshed suffices, but wouldn't it have been easier for Binghe to... He trailed off, looking away and making an awkward, embarrassed gesture with his fan. This master is sure that Binghe would not have been bereft of companionship as he traveled. Binghe shook his head in denial, vigorously enough for a few unruly curls to escape the simple silver guan, holding them back. No, this one refuses to do that with anyone that he didn't care for. Truthfully, there had been many offers from the various demonesses he had come across. Binghe had loathed every moment he had to endure the coquettish simpering or flirtatious posturing of those who could not comprehend that he was absolutely not interested, even when he told them so. If anything, it made some of them worse. For some reason, Shizun looked even more baffled, but his thin face couldn't seem to stand questioning it further. In all, while it could be better, Lu Binghe is not in terrible shape considering his ordeal, Mu Qingfan concluded. His heritage must be of a particularly potent lineage and quite close. What does Lu Shizi know of this? For a moment, Binghe hesitated. His blood grew convulsed in disquiet as he recalled Shizun's words at the edge of the endless abyss about how his ancestors could not be counted among average demons. That they weren't in the company of those demons that Shizun had said could be as good as well as evil. Binghe already knew those poisonous words had been false, that Shizun didn't believe them. So why did they still hold such power over him? This disciple does not know the circumstances of his parentage, he began slowly. But this one has heavenly demon blood and suspects he is at least a quarter such, perhaps even half. Surprisingly, the reaction this time came not from Lu Qingge, whose scowl never changed, but from Yu Qingyuan suddenly stilling. Lu Binghe would rather Lu Qingge have been the threat. After surviving the endless abyss, he gave it even odds that he might be able to hold his own against his least tolerable martial uncle. But Binghe held no such misapprehensions about his chances against the Qianding Peak Lord. If Lu Binghe is indeed half heavenly demon, then he is of the right age to be the son of the last known emperor of the demon realm, Yu Qingyuan said, his stare piercing. Tianling Jun was suppressed and sealed by the combined might of the four great sects after Huanhua Palace came forward with information that the demon emperor was planning an invasion of the human realm. According to Lao Gonzu, that information was obtained when Tianling Jun forced himself upon Huanhua's palace's head disciple, Su Shiyan. Lu Binghe felt himself go pale. It wasn't as if he hadn't thought of the possibility before. He was more than worldly enough to understand that unions between humans and demons were far more likely to be violent than consensual. A child sent downriver in a flimsy basket to either drown or freeze to death had to assume themselves to be unwanted. All the same, the confirmation hurt. And yet, Mu Qingfan made a derisive noise. Unlikely, he contradicted. At least in part. There are 101 ways available to a cultivator of that level to prevent pregnancy from coming to fruition, a dozen of which require only the use of their own qi. Pregnancies are delicate. Cross-species pregnancies even more so. If Lu Shizi was successfully carried to term, as he obviously was, then it was because the mother desired his birth. It felt like too much. The entirety of the day had consisted of nothing but emotional whiplash from one extreme to every other possible, and Binghe's head hurt nearly as much as his bruised heart. Shizun must have noticed, for Binghe felt a hand cup the side of his head and guide him to bury his face in his master's stomach. If there was one benefit to Shizun still wearing Binghe's outer robe, it was that black fabric wouldn't show evidence of tears. Yu Qingyuan looked politely away from Lu Binghe's grief, even as his thoughts churned. His trust in Huanhua Palace, which what there was of it to begin with, had already been entirely eroded once the old palace master had insisted on taking Shen Qingqiu into custody and confining him within the water prison without a prior conviction at trial. To find that the old cultivator had told at least one crucial lie in the past did not feel like a surprise. If anything, Yu Qingyuan was finding himself going over anything the old palace master had ever said within his hearing and wondering if it held any truth at all. The only thing he was uncertain of at this point was exactly what benefit Huanhua Palace thought they would gain from destabilizing the demon realm by imprisoning its emperor. Incursions along the border between the human and demon realms had only increased after the heavenly demon's suppression, not decreased, as he realized they should have if Tianling Jun had truly intended war. That seemed so obvious in hindsight that Yu Qingyuan was mildly ashamed that he never thought of it before. The only excuse that he could bring to mind was that at the time he had been very thoroughly distracted. Not only had he been going through his final preparations to ascend as sect leader, but Shen Qingqiu had refused to speak to him unless necessity demanded and made it clear how much he despised even those brief exchanges. Yu Qingyuan's heart ached, remembering those years, knowing now the system had been the cause of Shen Qingqiu's cold antipathy, or at least one of the causes. Qiji didn't delude himself that he hadn't earned at least some of that on his own. He wondered, surely the increased demonic incursions had to be a happy coincidence for the conflict-loving system. No mere curse could have such far-reaching power. Could it? Yu Shixian, Wu Qingfan, approached him. While this master has some ideas now regarding how the curse might be spelled, Ku Xing needs to be consulted about how to best perform the needed ritual. How soon can we return to Qingqian? Yu Qingyuan frowned. Huanhua is unlikely to grant permission for their artifact to leave their sect grounds, he said. The old palace master has already lost too much face after publicly heeding the accusations of the sower demons and then having Shen Shidi's trial entirely upended in this way. He will seek to regain his reputation by being instrumental in the breaking of the curse, even if just by having the event occur within his sect. The doctor's lips thinned, and Huanhua Palace's artifact cannot be removed from Shen Qingqiu until the curse is broken. He thought for a moment. Perhaps we could send Lu Shixian to Qingqian to retrieve Li Qingtian? While he hates to leave the sect, this one is sure he could be convinced. Yes, Lu Qingge could be convinced like that, in the sense that he would probably just pluck the protesting Peak Lord up off the ground, toss him over one shoulder, and fly straight back to Huyu City with him. Managing politics between Qingqian Mountain Sect and the rest of the Jianghu meant keeping in mind that request must be carefully made to the war god, who believed in his heart that the simplest solution to a problem was always the best solution. Yet that would mean remaining here for at least another day, more likely two, on top of the time needed for Li Shidi to plan, prepare for, and then perform the needed ritual. Yu Qingyuan yearned to have Shen Qingqiu back safely behind the sect's defenses, much upgraded since the demon saintess's invasion those few years ago. Shizun shouldn't stay here, they heard Lu Binga say, and found that he'd drawn back enough from Shen Qingqiu to peer at them with one tear-reddened eyes. This one caught the little palace mistress using her whip on Shizun while he was in the water prison. She wouldn't have dared unless she thought her father would condone it. White-hot rage flared through Yu Qingyuan. She dared. Huanhua dared. Qingqian Mountain Sect had reluctantly surrendered Shen Qingqiu to Huanhua Palace's custody only because Shidi had wanted to avoid a war between the two most powerful cultivation sects in the world. If Huanhua Palace wished to court that war anyway, Yu Qingyuan would see to it that there were no two stones left sitting atop each other of this gaudy golden monstrosity. Shen Qingqiu should have said he was injured, Mu Qingfan said, appalled, and reached into his sleeves for ointment. Shen Qingqiu shook his head. No need. Binghe already healed this master. None of the marks remain. Lu Shidi, Yu Qingyuan ordered quietly, veins still thrumming with fury. Go outside to Kishime. Instruct her to leave for now, and take all other members of the sect with her. This one knows she's been looking after and consoling Shen Shidi's disciples. If anyone asks, we are still working on a method to break the curse and should not be interrupted. Lu Qingge's eyes burned as they shared a long look before the bison war god nodded and strode from the room. The hand on his sword hilt was white-knuckled. The two of them should be more than enough to fight their way out of Huanhua Palace. Adding in Lu Binghe as even a very young and inexperienced heavenly demon would tip the scales even more. Mu Qingfan would look after Shen Qingqiu until they were beyond the sect walls, then Lu Shidi would need to take him up as their best flyer. We are not busting down a wall to get out of here, Shen Qingqiu said, his voice chiding. He was eyeing Yu Qingyuan knowingly over his fan. Right now, sympathies are with Kangqian Mountain Sect. Destroying even the sect that everyone else quietly dislikes will wipe out that sympathy in an instant. This master refuses to go to war with the entire cultivation world because you feel reckless and impatient, especially while this one is little more than dead weight. The longer Shen Qingqiu stays here, the more likely that outcome is, regardless of our limited patience, Yu Qingyuan pointed out. Every additional moment Huanhua Palace had to scheme to harm Shen Qingqiu, the less he would find himself caring about the consequences of acting rashly, and he knew every martial sibling present would support that decision. Qi Shimei would be particularly vicious in her reprisals. This Yu Qingyuan must admit that he is not feeling notably diplomatic at this juncture. Sangmen Shixian needs to spend less time with Lu Shidi if he is adapting the war god's lack of subtlety. Brute force is not the only method available to us. Shen Qingqiu looked down at the disciple still tucked into his side. As much as this one dislikes the use of it, would Binghe be willing to use Shinmo to open a way to Kangqian? To Qiankao Peak, Mu Qingfan specified. This one would very much prefer to have Shen Shixian in an environment with remedies close at hand. Lu Binghe frowned, but nodded. It will likely set off many wards when we arrived, he warned, voice hoarse. This Mu Qingfan will consider it as a suitable test of his peak's passive defenses. And it will still be more suitable and subtle than demolishing a sect we are still technically allied with. Shen Qingqiu looked smug. Yu Qingyuan's heart warmed, the fury dampened by just a hair. He had always thought that smug was a good look on Xiaoju, even when it was because he just won an argument with his Qi Gua. Maybe even especially then. We can do that later, his Shidi's disciple said with red-eyed anticipation. Heavenly demon or not, Yu Qingyuan thought he might find in himself a growing fondness for the boy. Unnoticed by any of the room's occupants, a slender green snake wiggled out through a crack in the wall. It had much to report. Ah, yes, our snake boy. Lu Binghe was visibly wary of the sword in his hands, holding it at an angle out from his body. Yu Qingyuan could not blame him. The way the blackened metal of the blade drank in the light grew more unsettling the longer it was contemplated. This master will step through first, then Mu Shidi, he ordered. Shen Shidi next, with Lu Shidi standing ready to defend if any of the cultivators outside since the forming of the portal. If any of the cultivators on Qiankao Peak responded badly to their sudden entrance, Yu Qingyuan wanted there to be there immediately to prevent any unfortunate reactions. Lu Qingge drew his sword and faced the door. Yu Qingyuan signaled to Lu Shidi. Liu Binghe took a deep breath, channeled demonic qi through Shinmo, which the sect leader felt surprisingly little of. The greedy blade drank in every dark spark it could, and slashed vertically through the air. A gash in the world opened before them, through which they could see the sunlight of Qiankao Peak. A gentle breeze poured past them, the atmosphere attempting to equalize between Huyue City and the thinner air of Tiangong Mountains. Yu Qingyuan stepped forward and through, and the transition felt like nothing at all. A handful of Qiankao disciples loitering near the entrance hall gaped at him as the gong of resentful qi detecting wards rang out. Yu Qingyuan called out for them to run for their senior healers, then turned to await the rest of their party as the disciples dashed off. Mu Qingfan stepped through next, without a hair out of place. It was when Shen Qingqiu stepped through that all hell broke loose. He cried out in shock as the paper talismans around his neck, the talismans forming the chief-suppressing array, caught alight with black flame. Within moments, the Peak Lord had fallen to his knees, then the ground, keening, as the immortal binding cables burst into shreds and violent chi violently tore at his meridians. Shizun! He heard Liu Binghe shout, barreling through the portal with Shinmo still drawn. Before he'd gotten a handful of steps, the boy stumbled with a strangled noise, only just getting his hands and swords under him before he impacted the cobblestones of the courtyard. Demonic energy flared around him, writhing up his arm like flaming serpents of corrosion and decay. A red light shone from his forehead. Yu Qingyuan was only just aware that Lu Qingge had dashed through the portal just a hair before it could close on him. He was too busy sinking to his knees next to the thrashing Shen Qingqiu, holding his shoulders to the ground as Mu Qingfan grabbed his wrist to try and halt the rampant deviation. The first of the talismans burned completely through, the black chi sparking with unnatural blue light. The sword! Shen Qingqiu coughed around a mouthful of blood, eyes wide and desperate with realization. Seal the... A violent convulsion prevented him from speaking further. Yu Qingyuan didn't need him to finish. He was moving before he had even completely turned away from Xiaoju. Shidi! He snapped. Lu Qingge seemed to blur as he appeared next to the deviating Liu Binghe, sword outstretched but hand locked in a rictus around the hilt. The war god swung, and the flat of his sword impacted Lu Shizi's fingers with a series of loud snaps as bones broke like twigs. Shinmo rang like a bell as it struck the cobblestones, something unnatural sounding in the reverberations of the demonic metal. Yu Qingyuan dashed towards the sword, pulling talisman paper from his sleeves. Xuansu was withdrawn just enough to slice his fingers bloody against its edge, the resulting shockwave of chi momentarily forcing all air from the courtyard. There were no thoughts in his mind, save for the seals he knew he must draw. Fortunately, he knew precisely which seals those were. His Shizun had made sure of it. If Xuansu's sheath is damaged or destroyed, he will almost certainly die, she had told her disciple, kneeling before her in empty penitence as he ached in Meridian's heart and soul, wondering whether he even truly wished to live when his Xiaoju was no more than the memory and ash. But if there is the barest chance for Qingyuan to save himself, these are the seals he must learn. For years, decades, Yu Qingyuan had regretted the depths of his fractured soul, the recklessness and impatience that had seen his life bound to Xuansu. But now he understood. It had been a necessary evil, a gift for this very moment. It had had a purpose. Except that where the seals used to bind, Xuansu absorbed energy of any nature and converted it to fire-natured qi to overwhelm Xuansu's metal nature. Yu Qingyuan had no intention of stopping it overwhelming Shinmo. The first talisman he drew replaced the fire radical with water, and he slapped it onto the sword with a surge of qi. The water-natured qi ate at the edges of Shinmo's bloodied metal, weakening it like rust would a mortal blade. The second talisman was drawn with the radical for wood qi, and he placed it close enough to the first that he could shift his hands and cover both. Yu Qingyuan closed his eyes to focus, blocking out the sounds of screams and shouting, smell of blood and herbs, alternating powerful surges of qi through each talisman, as strong as he could without destroying the paper, fire weakening and wood insulating in turn to wear away at Shinmo's stolen strength. Beneath him, the sword shrieked in fury and in agony. In his other hand, more slowly, he drew a third talisman identical to the seals binding Xuansu. Fire. He was nearly there. Shinmo was weakening as the chi reserves of the most powerful cultivator in the world were emptied into each talisman in turn. All that remained was. Yu Qingyuan gathered every remaining flicker and ember of his chi, channeling it into the fire-based talisman in his hand, and slammed it down onto the blade to discharge in a single, overwhelming burst. With a final shriek that burst his eardrums, Shinmo shattered. Shards of metal whipped past the sect leader's face when carving a bloody furrow across his cheek. All the world was silent. Blood trickled from his ears, and Yu Qingyuan closed his eyes and wept tears of joy and relief. He'd done it. At long last, Qi Gua had saved Xiaoju. Mu Qingfan withdrew his hands from Shen Qingqiu as his Shixian went limp beneath him, struggling to regain his breath. He quickly turned the man onto his side and thumped his back to help him cough out the remaining blood before he could aspirate on it. A quick check of his chi showed his meridians were raw and badly inflamed, still enduring the aftershocks of his induced chi deviation, but that Shen Qingqiu was for once not in immediate mortal peril. Be still, Shixian, he ordered, turning to assess the damages. The courtyard was in ruins, the cobblestones cracked in most places and outright melted in others. Lu Qingge was already on his feet and looked steady enough that he could wait for more medical assistance. Lu Shizi was still writhing from the after effects of his own chi deviation, and Mu Qingfan was making his way to the boy's side when Zhangmen Shixian abruptly collapsed over the remains of Shinmo. He needs an infusion of yin, quickly! The doctor shouted over his shoulder to the shell-shocked senior disciples standing at the edge of the destruction, gesturing towards the semi-conscious half-demon. He reached Yu Qingyuan and pulled the larger man over onto his back. Half his face was covered in blood, and there were a number of tears in his robes that would need inspection for hidden wounds, but it took only moments to realize that the sect leader was dangerously low on qi. Mu Qingfan called for his head disciple to head over a team of subordinate healers, tensely instructing him to maintain a constant flow of qi to keep Yu Qingyuan's spirit veins and meridians from collapsing from lack of internal pressure, trading the duty off between each of them as needed. Shen Qingqiu! Lu Qingge shouted. It had been a long day. A very long day, during which Mu Qingfan had found more cause to doubt his much-lauded skills than he had ever had before, not even the day he lost his first patient and his Shizun had to sit him down and speak to him of every doctor's inevitable sorrow and regret. The absolute last thing he needed right this moment was to find that Shen Qingqiu had, somehow, managed to crawl over to his distressed disciple and began to channel qi he didn't have to spare into the boy. They were on goddamn Qiankao Peak, Mu Qingfan fumed, standing over Shen Shixian and knocking him unconscious for the second time that day. There were actual qualified doctors available around them by the dozens. Shen Qingqiu belonged in a sickbed himself. Mu Qingfan was going to tie him to that sickbed. Oh, he was going to have such a talk with Shen Qingqiu. Notes. Quietly adds an epilogue to the chapter count. I'm expecting Airplane Bro in the epilogue. Knock on wood. I've never tried writing a hamster before. I gave serious consideration to having Yu Qingyuan pull Xuansu completely out in order to use its sheath with the built-in seals to shut Shinmo down. It would have been hella dramatic, and he would have done it in a heartbeat. But I couldn't see a way he'd survive that. Isn't it interesting how many parallels there are between Shinmo and the system when you lay it all out? And, the more time I spent writing this, the more I wonder if the cultivators actually have the right of things. Shen Yuan is what's left of Shenju, and if I'm joining Shen Yuan as an even more unreliable narrator than anyone expected. All right. To the epilogue. Uh-oh. There we go. All right. A sip of tea, and then we can finish. Chapter 4. Epilogue. To Mu Qingfan's astonishment, Shen Qingqiu was already stirring by the time he laid his Shixian onto a bed, one with a convenient sightline to the sickbed his disciple had been helped to just moments before. Only a fool would attempt to separate those two before they were on the mend, and Mu Qingfan did not consider himself to be a fool. Tempting as it was to immediately knock his Shixian unconscious once more, the doctor refrained. 3 times in one day was not just approaching the ridiculous, but well past it, and possibly detrimental to his health. Bingha, Shen Qingqiu mumbled, fretting over the boy's health when he didn't even have the strength to lift his own head. Shizun, Lu Shizi slurred back. He might have been in better overall health than Shen Qingqiu, no doubt owed to his particular constitution, but the disciple was still in absolutely no shape to be trying to get out of bed the way he was. Mu Qingfan sighed and strode over to push him back down. Rope. Mu Qingfan absolutely needed to locate some rope. Lots of rope, since he had a feeling he might need to tie down Zhangmen Shixian as well before the man woke up and went looking for Shen Qingqiu. A sudden disturbance in the hallway distracted the doctor from his most frustrating patients. A familiar voice complaining that he was just fine, that there was nothing to worry about. It had just been a sudden headache, and he really needed to get back to work now. Oh, airplane! Shen Qingqiu called out with sudden energy. Mu Qingfan frowned at him. He was going to need to check the man for a concussion. He just knew it. The sounds in the hallway stopped for a moment, then Shen Qingqiu appeared in the doorway. One of his Onding disciples was acting as a crutch under his shoulder, keeping the man upright. Bro! What the hell? The system chose death, Shen Qingqiu slurred. Shen Qingqiu blinked at Shen Shixian. Wait, what? Bro, no shit? Explains why it screamed like that. Thought my head was going to explode. Mu Qingfan, very slowly, closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Is this master to understand, he said, that Shen Shixian was also cursed? Shen Qingqiu tilted his head to look at the doctor and blinked at him. Oops, I forgot. Mu Qingfan resigned himself to a sleepless night as his patient list continued to grow. Shen Qingqiu, in a bed, now. Shen Qingqiu meekly complied. In hindsight, it was so very obvious that Shen Qingqiu sometimes wondered, as he tried to fall asleep at night, how the thought had never crossed his mind. Shen Mo hungered for conflict, violence, for even greater power. System claimed to seek entertainment powered by conflict and drama, and revenge, sex, and greed were the 3 root causes of violence. Shen Mo could cut through reality. It was one of its core abilities. Shen Yuan's soul had been taken from another reality. Shen Mo fed off of Lu Bingha, and System had outright stated that Lu Bingha was its power source. The price System had named to skip the endless abyss, endless hatred quest was impossible to pay. Of course, Shen Mo wasn't let anything prevent its chosen host from bringing it back out into the world to feed. Well, no. He knew why the thought hadn't occurred to him. Shen Yuan was the prime connoisseur of web novels, among which transmigration featured regularly. How many people, other than Shen Yuan, resolved that if they were to ever die and be transmigrated, they absolutely would not make fools of themselves in the first moment. Shen Yuan knew all about transmigration. He knew about systems. On some level, he expected a system to accompany the transmigration experience. There was no reason for him to question why system existed or where it had come from. It just did. Just was, like the sun or like gravity. Had Shinmo gotten the idea of posing as a system from him? He didn't think so. Airplane Bro had transmigrated decades before he did, after all. Shen Qingqiu had no problem with placing the blame squarely on that shitty author. Unless Shinmo was also the reason Airplane wrote Proud Immortal Demon Way to begin with. Yeah, Shen Qingqiu was really, truly tired of having thoughts like that keep him awake at night. Especially since Mu Shidi kept giving him the stink eye for not resting properly. Bro, Shen Qinghua muttered, I'm not sure if I'm more offended that you forgot about me or that you ended up narking on me anyway. Shen Qingqiu sniffed haughtily, his fan waving gently in front of his face. You think I spend time voluntarily thinking about you? More fool you. The sun on Qingjing Peak was warm, and the sky was blue. Shen Qingqiu had finally been allowed to return to his little bamboo house so long as he was accompanied by at least one other person. Needless to say, the person was generally Liu Binghe, who had reached new heights of stickiness since their return to King Qian Mountain Sect, and Shinmo's destruction. His disciple had been released from Qiankao Peak much sooner than Shen Qingqiu had, but no one would have known it for how little time he spent anywhere else. Shen Qingqiu suspected that Binghe had only been returning to Qingjing Peak in order to use the kitchens and to sleep, with every other moment spent by his bedside. Well, it wasn't as if Binghe had no reason to be a bit clingy after everything. Shen Qingqiu had decided not to say anything just yet. It was just too nice, getting to spend time with Binghe without the terror of his not-so-certain death looming over the transmigrator. Even now, Binghe was practicing his sword forms with Zhang Yang within eyesight of the bench where Shen Qingqiu was resting. Shen Qinghua perched next to him like a squirrel with a bag full of melon seeds. Has my son even let you out of his sight since it all went down? Airplane said, his cheeks distended as he tossed a few more seeds into his mouth. Shen Qingqiu swatted him with the fan. Don't call him that. And it's just a little separation anxiety. Perfectly understandable. He's a sweet bun who's had his whole life turned upside down. He just needs to find his footing again, and then Binghe will be off having adventures and wooing beauties without needing to hold this old man's hand. Shen Qinghua stifled a snort as he watched his stallion novel protagonist's son sneak a look at his shizun from beneath his lashes, then adjust ever so slightly to show himself at his best angle as his sword hummed through the air. Airplane knew his protagonist. The only thing Liu Binghe would be off doing once he found his feet was Cucumber Bro's poor ass. Though he supposed that would count as wooing a beauty. But Airplane also had a healthy sense of self-preservation, something his fellow transmigrator sorely lacked. So he was absolutely not going to say a word about any of that. I heard Qiankao Peak's courtyard has finally been repaired, Shen Qingqiu said absently, eyes pinned on his sweet bun of a disciple. Finally, he said, like repairs happened out of thin air. Shen Qingqiu scoffed, grabbing another handful of melon seeds. The dozen protective amulets draped around his neck clinked quietly with the movement. Moby June had given him yet another one just yesterday, scowling at him before leaving through a portal without a single word. His king really hadn't taken the news of his least favorite servant being cursed very well. Still, at least he hadn't taken it out on Shen Qinghua. He just kept shoving one amulet after another at him and glowering fiercely before going off to find another one. Cleansing the resentful qi was the most time-consuming part, really, he continued. Shin Mo has hell of a kick. At least it's gone and we never have to deal with it again. Or the system. Yeah, at least there was that. Qingqiu Mountain Sect had expected to have to deal with some tensions with Huanhua Palace. What they had not expected was for the delegation they had sent to return the torque of the unburdened heart to run into a gaggle of refugees led by Gong Yishao and headed towards Qingqiu. The sect had been destroyed in less than a day, the former head disciple reported, exhausted and grieving, by what he had sworn had been a single demon of overwhelming power. Both the old palace master and the little palace mistress were dead, and the head of the former had been impaled on a pike in front of the smoldering ruins. Shen Qingqiu pointedly ignored the matching pouts on the faces of Yu Qingyuan and Lu Binghe when they heard the terrible news. Nope, nothing to see there. It was not long afterward that a demon arrived at the base of the mountain, bearing word that a diplomatic representative of the Emperor of the Southern Demon Realm would be arriving the following day. Half a dozen peak lords waited near the gates for the demonic envoy to arrive. Shen Qingqiu had had to argue fiercely for the right to be present, even though he had returned to perfect health, sans without a cure. Between Lu Binghe and Mu Qingfan, he had hardly had a choice in the matter of resting, eating good food, and doing nothing more strenuous than overseeing a class here and there. He hadn't even been allowed off of Qingjing Peak in weeks. All the other peak lords had had to come visit him. Wei Shidi had even brought Hong Jing, which had given Shen Qingqiu a bad turn when he was handed the blade. Except, even without the system, Shinmo, camouflaging his occupation of the original good's body, Hong Jing still hadn't reacted? Shen Qingqiu was bewildered and almost a little offended. For a legendary sword, Hong Jing was sure falling down on its job of protecting the sect. Even with permission for his presence reluctantly given, Lu Binghe was keeping an eagle eye on him, and Yu Qingyuan was hovering at his elbow as if waiting for him to fall over. Shen Qingqiu felt very offended at their lack of confidence in his ability to remain standing upright while doing absolutely nothing taxing. Yugua, he hissed. If you don't back off, at least an arm's length, right this instant, the Shidi is going to smack you with his fan. Yu Qingyuan's worried smile relaxed and widened, creasing the corners of his eyes into crow's feet that matched his smattering of gray hairs. The nickname was a new thing between them, Shen Qingqiu no longer quite so comfortable maintaining his distance from the man who had nearly killed himself on his behalf. It felt right to use it, anyway, and it always made Yu Gua smile for real whenever he did. A commotion by the gates alerted them to a rapidly approaching group of half a dozen demons. In front, wearing a bamboo hat to keep the sun off his very pale and scaled skin, was a demon who looked even younger than Binghe. To Shen Qingqiu's shock, a close perusal of the youth revealed the mark of a heavenly demon on his brow, though in a dimmer green than Binghe's glowing red. Greetings to Qingqiu Mountain Sect, he said as he came to a stop in front of the gathered peak lords with a graceful bow of his head. The demons behind him each bowed shallowly at the waist. This humble one is Zuzi Lang, nephew and honored to represent the heavenly emperor Tianling Jun. Well met, Zuzi Lang, Yu Qingyuan said graciously in return with a bow of his own head. Only those closest to him would have recognized the tension in his shoulders. For what honor does Qingqiu Mountain Sect host the representative of the Demon Emperor? Zuzi Lang darted a glance at Shen Qingqiu, setting all kinds of alarm bells ringing. First, His Majesty bid this one convey his apologies for not inviting Qingqiu Mountain Sect to participate in the destruction of Huanhua Palace. He recognizes that Qingqiu had legitimate grievances against Huanhua, but felt that the injustices committed against his own person were greater and took precedence. No offense is taken on the part of this master or his sect, Yu Qingyuan responded, for all that he had been taken off guard. Nodding in acceptance, the demon once again glanced at Shen Qingqiu. His Majesty also wished this one to assure Qingqiu Mountain Sect that all grievances committed by your sect against His Majesty have been forgiven, in recognition of Peak Lord Shen's care and consideration towards both His Majesty's son and potential heir, and this humble servant. What? This master apologizes to the Honorable Zazi Lang, Shen Qingqiu replied, pulling on his bullshitting skills as hard as he could. He does not recall meeting such a distinguished demon. Peak Lord Shen showed great kindness to this one and even spared his life in Bailu Forest, though this one wore a far more monstrous form at the time. Zazi Lang replied, outright bowing to him with a gentle smile. Oh. Shen Qingqiu had a hard time reconciling the gentle-faced youth in front of him with the fascinating, but admittedly very ugly, snake demon he had met 2 years ago. Perhaps the scales were the same color? Wait, this master apologizes. By His Majesty's son, does the Honorable Zezilang refer to this master's disciple, Luo Binghe? Indeed, Luo Binghe is the son of Tianling Jun and the human Shu Shiyan. Shen Qingqiu snapped his fan open, very aware of Luo Binghe standing just behind him and staring intently between himself and Zezilang. For Luo Binghe to be referred to as only a potential heir, does Binghe possess siblings? That would be one hell of a departure from the novel, but considering there were apparently already 2 more heavenly demons running around than expected, who knew how many more there could be? Binghe might have a whole clan even. But Zazi Lang shook his head. No, His Majesty has only one child. However, His Majesty is undecided regarding Luo Binghe's suitability as his heir. For his human blood? Shen Qingqiu was outraged on his disciple's behalf. Of course Binghe was suitable. Tianling Jun ought to be honored to be related to his Binghe. Luo Binghe's blood is no issue. However, Tianling Jun is given to understand that Peak Lord Shen has been poisoned without a cure. Yet, despite Peak Lord Shen's many years of care and tribulations on his behalf, Luo Binghe has not yet deigned to cure Peak Lord Shen of his infliction, despite the ease a heavenly demon would have in providing the cure. Tianling Jun is reluctant to name one as his heir who does not honor his debts. Oh, Shen Qingqiu did not like where he thought this was heading. This disciple can cure Shizun? Binghe blurted out, stepping out of the group. How? This one has searched for years. Where's the cure Zazi Lang speaks of? This Binghe won't rest until it's found. Oh, no. No. Zazi Lang blinked at his cousin. We had not considered that Luo Binghe might simply be unaware. Dual cultivation with a heavenly demon will cure very nearly every ailment known. Without a cure is no exception. Luo Binghe outright gaped at the demon, then slowly swiveled his head to stare intently at Shen Qingqiu, who stared back like a mouse caught in the gaze of a cobra. Dual cultivation with Shizun, he said softly, cheeks flushing a fetching pink. Luo Binghe, why are you looking at this master like you want to eat him? Of course, if cousin is unwilling, or if Peak Lord Shen prefers, Tianling Jun has offered the services of this humble one to act as a cure, Zazi Lang said, bowing his head to look shyly up at Shen Qingqiu through his eyelashes. It was fortunate that brawls were apparently an expected part of demonic diplomacy as well as between family members. The dialogue between demons and cultivators didn't suffer at all from Luo Binghe doing his level best to gut his cousin. The end. Notes. Somehow this was the hardest chapter of the bunch to write. Brains are weird. The title was based on an idiom I read ages ago, one about how just because you witness something happen doesn't mean you understand the truth of what happened. I thought it would be a cute way to reference the unreliable narration of the cultivators regarding the system. Then about halfway through the second chapter, I realized it was referencing Shen Qingqiu's unreliable narration of the system versus Shinmo. Now, at the end of it all, it's referencing the author's unreliable narration of Shen Yuan versus Shen Zhu. Is he or isn't he? Well played, subconsciousness. Well played. I know I dropped in some foreshadowing of a Bingua extra, but I don't actually intend to write it. It would be nothing but an angst fest, as it commenter very wisely put it, that's the world where Shinmo won. So there's actually works inspired by this one. It's like called Okay, but What Do I Do / React to This by Flo Writes. So if you want more, you could go ahead and check that out too. But in any case, what a fun time. I enjoy this greatly. And also thank you to, I want to say this correctly, CaveteDracones, which I'm probably not saying correctly, but I'm doing my best. Thank you so much for letting me read your work. I had a great time doing this, and I know everyone who's listening or has listened to it also did as well. So make sure that you go ahead and say hello, maybe leave a comment, definitely leave a kudos, maybe bookmark, maybe subscribe to CaveteDracones, and have a wonderful rest of your day. I will see you tomorrow with another fanfic. Bye-bye!